A government big enough to make sure that nobody can make a bad decision is big enough to make sure that nobody can make an innovative decision. I think an unrighteous law should be disobeyed. I think it's our duty and obligation.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. Today our returning guest is Joel Salatin, co-founder of Polyface Farms. He's a farmer, an activist, an educator, a writer, and a widely sought-after speaker on topics about self-sufficiency and cooperating and living with the land. Joel has been here in the past to talk with us about the self-contained home, and folks, this just ain't normal. He's back today to talk to us about food emancipation. Joel, welcome back to Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you, Dunnigan. It's great to be with you.
One of the topics that you've spoken about is especially intriguing to our listeners. We've had you on here talking about people becoming more self-reliant and being able to raise their own food and have integrity of knowing where their food came from. You've even talked with us about people who have had to become creative in finding ways of distributing the fruits of their labor if the local either HOA or other zoning laws don't permit retail, that sort of thing. But the question is broader than that and deeper in the sense of this encroachment on people's liberties of all kinds of regulations that have made what's just common sense and ordinary ways of sharing the fruits of what people can grow for themselves illegal or nigh impossible. And in your talk about food emancipation, you talk about why can't you buy raw milk, ice cream with eggs in it, or homemade sausage. You talk about America's corporate food system, bureaucratic and profit-centered, and it ends up offering actually less choices, even though it gives the perception of abundance, and how people can ever imagine that these common sense things would have been outlawed, would have never been imagined by the framers of the Constitution. So if you can just help us to understand, especially when people talk about the possibility of hard times or needing to rely not on the fragile, just-in-time supply chain, system to help them get what's necessities for the survival of their family. They want to be able to rely not only on themselves, but upon those around them and communities and so on. But the system doesn't always enable that, doesn't even allow that, and sometimes is outright hostile to it. So if you could just spell out for us, what is the nature of the problem? How big is it? How long has it been going on? And then at the end, if we can talk more about what people can do about it so that they can actually share the necessities of life with those that they trust around them.
Well, yeah, that sounds like a great roadmap for an exciting discussion here. You interrupt me anytime. I'll not go too long without your coaching along. Essentially, what we've got today is, we've got supermarkets, but there are a lot of things that people who care about their health and about nutrition, and indeed resiliency, realize that the supermarket, for all of its seeming abundance, actually doesn't have a lot of choice, and it doesn't have much accountability, and most of what's there is not very nutritional. So, historically, resilient food systems were founded in a community. A community that couldn't feed itself wasn't very secure. It couldn't survive very well, and so in a breakdown of society, whether it's economic breakdown, pathogenic breakdown, whatever the breakdown is, it's always much more resilient and stable, an individual family, an individual household, if you have a direct link to your food, either growing it yourself or a direct link with, neighbors and things like that to actually, I'll tell you what, why don't you grow, you do really well with berries, so you'll grow berries over there, and, we'll grow our potatoes over here, and we trade around, and that's how you have, resilience, and each person can do their good things. And I'll I'll figure out the energy system here for your house, and you milk the cow, and we'll drink the milk, and we'll make sure you have energy and that sort of thing. And so it's this neighbor to neighbor commerce that is the foundation of actual social stability, is being able to engage in commerce neighbor to neighbor. Well, what's happened is with food safety laws in this country, after 1906 with Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, Teddy Roosevelt put in the Food Safety Inspection Service, and of course, after The Jungle was written, the great big meat packers dropped in sales almost 50% within 6 months, and were facing bankruptcy. People were moving back to their community, slaughterhouse and community food systems there in the early part of the 1900s, and the big packers begged Teddy Roosevelt, please give us government inspection so we can get our credibility back and get our customers back. And so, of course, he was a socialist, and so he said, sure, I'll do that. So he gives them an agent, he gives them the Food Safety Inspection Service, which start like all these things. They start very sincerely with good intentions, but what it has morphed into is essentially a food tyranny, to where I can't sell you a glass of raw milk from my cow. I can't make a quiche and sell it to you. And we now have tremendous increasing numbers of certifications and GAP, good agriculture practice requirements, all sorts of things that make it incredibly difficult to engage in neighbor-to-neighbor food commerce. And so this affects the amount of choice that I, as a consumer, can enjoy. It pushes me more to the supermarket, makes it very difficult or illegal, impossible for me to acquire the food of my choice from the source of my choice. And secondly, it has a huge impact on the cost of local food, because with the regulatory environment, the stipulations are not scalable. They scale up very well. They're primarily industrial requirements. They scale up very well, but they don't scale down very well. Let me give you. I'll finish with a little story that just happened this week. So on our farm, we're getting ready. We do a lot of activities here. We do. People come to the farm and buy things all the time, and so we have this steady flow of people, and we service 6,000 families, and we'd like to take some of the things that we do, like overages, and turn them into a value-added product. Pot pies, shepherd pies, meat pies, chicken broth, lard. Basic kind of boxable prepared foods. And so anyway, so last week I had the inspectors out. We have a real nice kitchen on the farm. It's 2 ovens and just a beautiful. I mean, it's the one that we use for all of our interns. We have an on-farm chef in the summer that does our evening meal cooking, and so it's a spacious, beautiful, nice kitchen. And inspector walks in. Oh, he said, "This is nice. This is beautiful. Nice fiberboard walls, washable walls. I mean, all the stipulations." He says, "Where's the bathroom?" I said, "Well, we've got 4 bathrooms 100 yards away. We have 2 in our house, 2 in Mom's house. We've got 2 porta potties, including a handicapped one over just 50 yards away." And he said, "Oh, you have to have a bathroom hooked up to it, adjacent to the kitchen." I said, "Well, why? 100 yards. Why is that too far to walk?" He said, "Well, you just have to have one." And so you can't make a single pot pie and sell it out of here, without an approved, licensed, compliant, septic system, drain field, $20,000 deal. Then I said, "Well, now wait a minute. If I had a food truck, if I had a trailer, and I was making pot pies and selling them on the street in Stanton, I don't need a bathroom." He said, "No." He said, "If you have a food truck, there's no bathroom requirements whatsoever." I said, wait, let me get this right. I said, you're telling me that if I had a food truck that's on an axle and I can legally sell these pot pies, if I take that food truck and take the chassis out from under it and set it on blocks so it's no more portable, now suddenly I have to have a $20,000 septic field, drain field, and bathroom. He said, that's exactly right.
Oh my!
And so I could regale you with stories for a day, okay, like this. And there is, any thinking person understands there is absolutely no food safety reason for this, this requirement. There's zero food safety, but what it does is, it means that on our farm, we've got 6,000 families crying for a product that we would like to make. We can make it. They want to buy it. We want to make it and sell it, but we can't do it without a $20,000 permitted, bathroom septic field that's extremely complicated, costly to maintain, everything else. When we already have 4 bathrooms within 100 yards.
Here, I thought you were just going to tell us how you figured out how to get an axle underneath your building there.
No, well. so then I say, all right. So I say, okay. So if we brought a food truck in here, then we could do it. He said, absolutely.
Oh,
now, isn't that ridiculous? So he wants us to, so we can dispense with the bathroom if instead we invest, $10,000, $12,000 in a food truck. But here's the kicker. If we make pot pies in a food truck and sell them, that's fine if people consume them on site. But if we have 30 of them left over that we didn't sell this week, we put them in the freezer, we can't sell them tomorrow for you to take home and eat. That's illegal. But if we sell them to you on site and you eat them on site, that's legal.
So these kind of arbitrary and just business sort of labyrinthine legal restrictions can really put the damper on over-regulating, can really make it difficult for people to do what's just common sense kind of commerce. But how does that impact also the ability of people just to provide for themselves, their friends, and their neighbors, and share and lean on each other when times get hard?
Well, I mean, then you get into the point that all of this stuff I'm describing, whether it's raw milk or homemade pot pies or whatever, cheese, charcuterie, bologna. I mean, we here's a good one. We go out and we shoot a couple of deer, and so we take the venison up to a place a few miles away, and they turn it into wonderful summer sausage, okay, and put it in nice, like 2-pound tubes, and I mean, it's the best stuff in the world, okay? But because it's wildlife, there is zero licensing of this facility. So they can do it for, 500 different people and make their summer sausage for them. We pay them, by the pound, and they do it for us. But it's illegal for them to do 1 pound of beef summer sausage, because that's domestic livestock. Venison is wildlife, and so they can do it and we can eat it, and no bureaucrat, no oversight, no government participation whatsoever. Nobody's checking to see if the deer has Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, if it's healthy, if it's got parasites, pathogens, looking at the liver. Nobody's looking at anything. We can't even take that. It's illegal for them to allow a pound of beef in their building. They can't even let a pound of beef in their building.
Interesting.
So clearly, this is not about safety, because if it was about safety, then you'd need inspectors to do the venison as well as the beef or anything else that you did. So it's clearly it's not about safety. It's about regulating market access. Now the bureaucrats will say it's about safety, but these kinds of hypocrisies or inconsistencies indicate very clearly it's not about safety, it's about market access. And so what's happened is that this kind of market manipulation, this regulatory climate, it makes local food systems very, very difficult to access. You know, if to do bologna I need a $5,000 thermometer, for example, that's a spit in the ocean if I'm making a tractor trailer load at a time. But if I'm making a 5-gallon bucket full of bologna at a time,
right,
that $5,000 thermometer is going to preclude me from ever starting the business. See, all innovation requires embryonic prototypes. Nothing starts fully developed. You know, an oak tree doesn't transplant as an oak tree; it transplants as a little acorn. Babies are not born at 50 pounds; they're born at 6 pounds. And so all innovation, new ideas require an embryonic birth, the smallest form that it can take to be birthed. And the problem is that when you put all of these overheads and restrictions and regulatory and infrastructure requirements on even 1 pound of cheese, 1 pound of bologna, 1 gallon of milk, whatever, when you put all of those restrictions on it, it means that the business idea, the entrepreneur's dream, has to be birthed so big that the embryo is too big to be birthed. And I can tell you that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of frustrated entrepreneurs ready to serve their neighbors with resilient, stable, neighbor-to-neighbor food sufficiency that are unable to do it because they can't put together all the capital to launch under these kinds of heavy-handed circumstances.
And from what you're saying, it sounds like the origins of this are not because there was a litany of deaths and injuries and unrecoverable illnesses from small batch or home scale food, but it was protectionism in sort of a crony capitalist protectionism that just to drive out small producer competition. Yeah.
Now, nobody in the system would say that that's what it is, but that is actually what it has come to. It has come to a point where all the regulations are very non-scalable. They scale up well, but they don't scale down, and that's one of my definitions of a good regulation. A good regulation. I'm not an anarchist, maybe close, but I'm not an anarchist, and my position is that a good regulation is one that is not prejudicial towards size. I mean, let's give you an example. An example would be the speed limit regulation on a highway. That is absolutely the same. It's the same compliance cost for a car as it is for a tractor trailer, or the number of miles you drive compared to a person that drives a lot of miles or the person that drives very few miles. It is a very non-prejudicial regulation. Everybody has to do it, and it doesn't affect anybody, any particular person or entity any worse than anybody else. So that's an example of a good regulation. But a bad regulation is one in which it's very easy for the big guys to comply, but it's very, very difficult for little guys to comply.
Now, do you think in some of those areas that, I mean, I'm thinking like food holding temperatures and not mixing of, using the same cutting board for raw poultry versus raw salad. There's some things that make a lot of sense, but that also doesn't seem to impose a undue burden on the small producer. Do you think that some of the virtuous intent of some of those non-scalable rules could be remedied with some intelligent counter proposals? And are you aware of any organizations or who have said to whoever it is that's setting these regulations, look, if you'll just address these 10 concerns in this way, you can alleviate the undue burden and still look after public safety.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that that yes, there are exemptions, and many and there is the cottage. It's called kind of the cottage food laws movement, the cottage food laws movement, and the food sovereignty movement, which was launched in Sedgwick, Maine, a couple of years ago, and is now spread to a couple of other cities. This whole this whole libertarian food local food community movement is definitely gaining steam, and there's more and more interest in it as people, as consumers realize, well, I want this and I can't get it. So there's definitely movement here. And what's interesting is that almost all of the exemptions, or the I'll just call them exemptions, or the freedom. Let's call it freedoms. Let's not stigmatize it with exemptions. Let's call it the freedoms that are offered. Generally, all define either the type of transaction, i.e., it's direct producer-consumer. In other words, I can't sell to a Kroger's or a Bi-Lo's or a Whole Foods. I have to sell directly to what's called an end user. So if you're going to buy my stuff, take it to your kitchen, fix it for yourself and your family, that's called an end user. It can't go to a middleman, okay? So they define it by type of transaction. That's a real common one. They define the liberty by numerically, number of milk cows. In poultry, it's number of chickens slaughtered per year, number of eggs laid per year. Okay, there are wonderful those kinds of things. And then the third liberty, the third freedom, is given on type of product. For example, in Virginia, 2 years ago, we got food freedom for baked goods. Okay, these are non-hazardous things. I mean, it's not custards and pies, but baked goods, breads and pastries. Okay, the donuts. Those can be now done in Virginia in your home kitchen and sold to end users. So here we have two. We have two requirements. One is transaction, and one is food type. So you can make donuts in your kitchen, sell them to end users, as many as you want, without any regulations whatsoever. And this makes sense to define it by type, by transaction, or by number, recognizing that there is very, very little risk when neighbors are interacting with neighbors. It's not some faceless, sightless place from 1,000 miles away in a opaque, unaccountable industrial warehouse. It's the accountability. It's the close chain of custody here in accountability. Number two, that chain of custody, that close neighbor-to-neighbor commerce, creates not only this accountability, but it creates a knowledge base, about things. It's among consenting adults. Look, a government that is big enough to ensure that nobody can make a bad decision by patronizing, a bad neighbor's food. A government big enough to make sure that nobody can make a bad decision is big enough to make sure that nobody can make an innovative decision. The problem is that you can't have complete risk-free decision making and allow liberty decision making. You can't have it both ways. If you say we're going to take all the risk of decision making out, then nobody can make a decision. And if nobody can make a decision, then there's no place for freedom and liberty and innovation to ever enter, because everything is completely defined. And so critically, this ability to interact with each other as consenting adults, exercising our freedom of choice, is perhaps, the most, it's one of the most intimate freedoms that we have. It's as important. It's as much of our self-affirmation of ourselves as the freedom to worship or speak or assemble or, any of the other things that we do, the freedoms that we enjoy.
Speaking of freedoms, why wasn't the right to grow and share and sell to each other the produce of our own farms, our own communities, why wasn't that guaranteed in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights?
I think that the reason, as opposed to say, guns or whatever, I think the reason is because nobody at that time, we didn't have supermarkets until 1946. So I think it was simply that nobody at that time could have conceived of a time when it would have been illegal to sell a pail of milk to your neighbor, or to make some cottage cheese and sell it to your neighbor, or a pot pie, or anything. They simply could not have imagined that would ever happen, and so it wasn't on their radar. It's just like they couldn't have imagined computers or jets or whatever else, escalators. There's a lot of stuff they couldn't have imagined.
Well, it runs so counter. What I'm hearing you saying is it runs so counter to common sense. It's just in our innate knowledge of natural law is that people should be able to breathe the air, drink the water, eat the food, share with each other, and some of those just basic things of life about the definitions of what makes fundamentals of life wouldn't have come into question.
Sure. Well, when you bring up natural law, what we're hinting at is, do I own myself? Do I? Who owns me? And we went through this with the with all the non-public education, from homeschooling to parochial schooling to correspondence course schooling back 35 years ago when we had all these legal battles over who owns the child, and of course the government said, well, we own the child, and different groups said, well, no, children are owned by God, we're custodians, there were numerous answers to that, but there were a lot of other views besides the state owns the child. And today we're back to this same question of who owns me, and do I have the choice to decide my own body's fuel? And you see, if the state owns me, if society owns me, then it has a vested interest in making sure I don't participate in reckless activity. Reckless activity, of course, being defined by the orthodoxy of the day. The orthodoxy of the day, of course, today being defined by Monsanto, Tyson, Ciba-Geigy, and Archer Daniels Midland. So that's the orthodoxy of the day defines risky behavior, and so I think it's fascinating that for 50 years the most credentialed experts in the government told us and promoted us eating, using hydrogenated vegetable oil, get rid of that butter, get rid of that lard, and go to margarine and Crisco and hydrogenated vegetable oil. Now here we are 50 years later. Not only are they saying it's not good for you, the tolerance level is not just a few pounds a year, it is zero. There is zero tolerance. And yet this was the official dietary guidelines, the official instructive push from the most credentialed experts in the entire society. That is why innovation can only come in a climate where we ensure the ability of the lunatic fringe, the radicals, the heretics, to survive. And I think the fact that the Romans had this axiom that you could tell whether a society was strong or weak by the number of laws that it had, I think that's just such a such an amazing axiom, because it's the truth. You know, as a society becomes weak and vapid and paranoid and fearful, it begins to fear the weirdos. But when a society is strong and virulent and self-assured and confident, well, who cares if there's some weirdos out there? You know, hey, it's fine. You know, let them, you know, mess themselves up. Who cares? It is only when a society is weak and fearful that it starts outlawing, criminalizing, demonizing, or marginalizing the lunatic fringe, the heretics, which is, of course, where all innovation comes from. That's by definition, innovation comes out of the lunatic fringe. And so I read an interesting book recently. It was a permaculture book on urban permaculture, and it had this fascinating sense in it. It said, it was written by Peter Bain, and it said that in times of epochal change, and we could argue right now if we're in a time of epochal change, but let's just assume that we are for a minute. In times of epochal change, the most important thing to preserve is the freedom of dissensus. That if we're so devoted to consensus, what happens is people shut down their out of the box thinking. They shut down their creativity because we all got to get together on this. Come on, we all got to get together this. And we're so concerned about coming to consensus that we forget that the real breakthroughs are when we preserve dissensus and listen to the rabble-rousers. So the question is, you know, who owns me? And when the government says, you know, that they own me as an individual, well, they have a vested interest in making sure that I don't drink raw milk or that I don't eat compost-grown tomatoes or homemade charcuterie, because, you know, that could make me, you know, that's risky, that's unsanctioned, it's you know, it's unlicensed behavior and food choices. And so when a government, you know, I say when a government gets between my lips and my throat, I call that an invasion of privacy.
Well, we've had a recent guest on, Mike Rivero, who was talking about for-profit corporations who are using up the last remaining unpolluted aquifer in California, taking the Californians' own water and then bottling it, selling it back to them at a huge profit. Other examples you mentioned, like GMO producers, you know, ADM or others, who are basically creating frankenfoods and then patenting them and then going criminally prosecuting other farmers whose crops are contaminated by this.
Yeah.
And so and we've dealt with that both. You mentioned homeschooling, but I'm thinking about home birth as well. Basically, all of the critical components of life itself. That is birth and raising of children, eating, drinking, and all of those things becoming and educating, all of those becoming monopolized by a profit-seeking elite that then outlaw with always these virtuous-sounding rationalizations of why these things are being outlawed. It's for your own safety, it's for your own good, it's because you're not qualified, whatever. But the outcome is people falling into this passive, dependent state of mind. And you mentioned that it shuts down people's innovative bent and our creativity. I mean, that's our natural gift. So we have Yankee ingenuity, that sort of thing. That's how humans have survived these many years, is through our stubborn creativity. And so people are concerned, and people now looking at the fragility of modern society and saying, I don't trust that, I don't want to bank my family's survival on all this working out optimally. I want to have a plan B. I want to have more resilience. So if you could kind of guide us now into what kinds of things can people do to opt out of this servile dependence, no matter how rationally it's promoted or packaged, it doesn't sound like it really holds much water. It's not really for our own good. So what can people do who say, enough, I've had enough of that, I will no longer be dependent on that, I want to make sure that I can provide for my family, my neighbors, my friends, and then also, is there things they can do to influence their communities to opt out of this as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, first of all, and I know that our listeners here absolutely get doing for yourself. So I mean, and the truth is, there are a lot of things you can do for yourself. Whether it's have your garden, a beehive on the roof of the house, a cistern, collect the roof water, go to a grate, go to a replumb a little bit so that you don't put potable water in your toilet, drop your water bill, drop your sewage, and put on a solarium on your house so so that you're not spending as much on energy, and you can grow your lettuce and stuff in the wintertime, season extension, take that basement cold corner, put a little wall around it, put a bunch of insulation in there, make a root cellar, so you can take your squash and your pumpkins and your sweet potatoes and your potatoes and carrots and turnips, and you can put them in there for the winter. There's a lot of things that you can do in your own domicile to turn it from a net liability and turn it into a net asset from an energy, water, food, standpoint. So that's certainly a starting place. But then beyond that, as we've talked about this commerce, beyond that, then build relationships with actual food producers in your community. Fortunately, this, what I call the local food tsunami, is real. And I've talked a lot about pushback here today, and we can throw stones at Monsanto or whatever. But the truth is that if you build relationships with the farmers in your community who are not beholden to Monsanto, who are doing building soil and growing crops that you can save seed from, for example, open pollinated, not doing GMOs and things like that. If you build a relationship with these folks, you will have a direct line into your food, and to be able to lie down at night and visualize your food chains going directly to fields, within walking or bicycling distance from your home, of people that you know by name and you can, have a relationship with, that is so much more spiritually and physically and emotionally, gratifying and resilient than lying down at night knowing that, well, let's see, the free trade treaties have to keep going. There can't be any wars. The longshoremen have to be happy with their wages. The Teamsters have to be happy with, the diesel has to keep flowing. I mean, you think about all the things that have to run in synchronicity to maintain that 3-day supply of food in the supermarket, and it's actually an extremely fragile system. So as you develop this relationship with your farmers, then you start building your larder. And we don't use the term anymore, but I'm a huge believer in a larder. I mean, today, if we lost power and lost the whole thing, I've got, Teresa cans, 800 quarts of stuff every winter. I mean, I've got months of food here. We've got, all sorts of food right here. When she sends me shopping, she gives me a list. I go downstairs, I bring up a quart of green beans and applesauce and tomatoes, and that's how I go shopping. And you can dehydrate. You can make jerky. I mean, there's huge numbers of ways now. We have high-tech dehydrators, high-tech and cool, techno gadgetry in our domestic culinary arsenal. We don't have to go fetch water in a wooden bucket from a spring anymore. So use your techno gadgetry to leverage your own local food resiliency and treasures, and gradually build your own in-home larder, and gradually wean yourself away from the supermarket, and and inform yourself how to cook. I mean, there is no simpler way to cook a meal from scratch than a slow cooker or a crock pot. I mean, the thing takes 40 watts of power a day. It's about as much as two flashlights, and you just stick the stuff in there in the morning. And if you eat at 4, it's ready. If you eat at 5, it's ready. If you get stuck late, you don't get in till 10 o'clock, it's still ready. And it's not dry, and it tastes great. And it just sits there and bubbles along all day, and it's juiceless. It's the easiest thing. It's a 10-minute meal. And so quit getting processed stuff, and develop your own culinary skill and your culinary know-how, so that you can go direct to fields, go direct to farmers, and get unprocessed raw materials, bring it in, prepare it, package it, process it, preserve it, in a home-centric system. All of us understand that, that listen to this program, we know that ultimately resiliency, by definition, means that we're not depending on the government. We're not depending on Wall Street. And so ultimately, our resiliency comes down to depending on our own knowledge base, our skill level, and our own acquisition of the foundations of life. And the more we can develop that in our own home, the more insulated we'll be.
And in addition to being able to take care of our own families, as you're describing, how does that? What opportunities are there for elevating this in our communities that we live in, whether it's in a small town or a suburb or whatever? What can we do to get out of this? What do you call the stupid stage or something, and actually elevate us back to reclaim some uncommon common sense in the communities where we live?
Well, I guess it sounds simplistic, but my answer is have your neighbors over to dinner. It sounds simplistic and almost silly, and intuitively, we understand that that's the basis of community. But whether they're Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, Greenies, Socialists, doesn't matter. Have your neighbors over to dinner. Cook them a really, really great meal. They'll sit down and say, "Wow, this is amazing," and it didn't come out of Chef Boyardee. It didn't come from a DiGiorno's frozen pizza. And you start this conversation, and if you're doing some cool things, a solarium and gray water return, whatever, doing some cool stuff. Got some patio, potted plants there, and you got instead of growing, geraniums, you're growing tomatoes, and you've got a vermicomposting bin under the sink, whatever. The point is that from grassroots, from the ground up change is ultimately the way to change society. And so the Stephen Covey habits of highly effective people, one is, stay within your sphere of influence. Well, you can't influence the senator very much. You can't influence, Tyson Foods. But you know what? You can influence your neighbor. Your neighbor's sitting right there, and they're already proximate. You don't have to travel anywhere, and you can create that relational, educational, infotainment situation, with your neighbor, and it's as easy as just knocking on their door saying, "Hey, come over for dinner Thursday evening." And we sequester ourselves today behind our computers, our laptops, our chat rooms, our virtual conversations, and I mean those are good as well as they go, but ultimately, hey, if you invite 6 neighbors, let me tell you this, and I've done some local community activism stuff. I used to work on the newspaper and things like this, and I can tell you that in the average, our nearby city. Our county has 50,000 people in it. Stanton, the city, has 20,000 people in it. So, we're small town America here, okay? And I can tell you that if you got 5 or 6 of your neighbors to sign on to something, whether it's a backyard chicken, ordinance to allow backyard chickens, or food sovereignty, so that within the locale you can sell food to each other without government intervention, whatever it is, okay? If you got 6 of your neighbors to go with you down to city council or whatever, in the average community of America, not a great big city, no, but in the average community of America, you're down there with 6 or 7, couples or entity people, households, and you will be the front page of the newspaper tomorrow. You will own the meeting. It is hard to get, people together on things. And I don't know, I don't know any shortcut. Look, if I had a shortcut to that, I'd be running the, presidential campaign for somebody. There's no shortcut to it except just, one-on-one, leverage what we have, leverage the relationships we have, and just start the conversion.
For people who may be reluctant thinking, our channel's Reluctant Preppers, I don't think that people here have any doubt that there's value in that, and that that's an important thing of reclaiming their independence. For people who are concerned that, it sounds like you're skirting on the edge of civil disobedience or bending or defying the laws or the regulations or whatever, I think you've spoken in the past with some humor and so on about how you can alleviate some of that concern of thinking you have to be fastidiously in compliance with ridiculous regulations.
Well, one of my books is Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. What's funny is a lot of times I get introduced to do a speech, and they say he's the author of the book Everything I Do is Illegal, and I have to say, well, no, I didn't say everything I do is illegal. I said everything I want to do is illegal. There's a big difference. But yes, there are. So I've talked about it. Just what an individual can do. But beyond that, you can certainly skirt, and I'm a believer in civil disobedience. I think an unrighteous law should be disobeyed. I think it's our duty and obligation to push back pretty violently on extremely bad, unrighteous things, and we certainly push things here. So there are ways to interact in commerce that do circumvent some of these requirements. One is the community-supported agriculture, a CSA. That's been deemed non-commerce, so you can participate in that and get along. Another is buying club type things where you prepay and then your purchases simply become debits against your prepayment, and because you've invested in the private club, that's what's being done by John Moody in Louisville, Kentucky. They got 20,000 members, 2,300 members, on a storefront, in Louisville, and they're just flaunting. They're doing raw milk, they're doing, moldy cheese, everything illegal you can imagine. The state can't touch them because it's a private club. And so there are some wonderful mechanisms now that are being done. And of course, the group that's pushing this is the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, which is a group of attorneys who it's like the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, where you join as either a consumer or a farmer. They've got 2 different levels of joining, but it entitles you to real-time legal counsel for getting around or finding loopholes or complying easily if every battle's not worth fighting. And so sometimes compliance is easier, sometimes non-compliance is easier, and they will shepherd you through that decision and help you. And they've got templates for raw milk herd shares and now it's morphing even to whole farm shares where people are divesting their entire farm to their customers, and so there's no commerce occurring. Everybody just invests in the farm and then gets their return on investment, which means it's not actually food sales. So there's a lot of creativity going on at the nub of this overarching government interventive regulatory structure, and I just love it. And if we spend as much time being devious, being creative at finding ways around these absurdities, if we were as aggressive about that as we are about haranguing against the system, I think we would see an explosion of really viable, vibrant, kind of countercultural food commerce that would be very exciting.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot of, no pun intended, food to think, to chew on here, as far as food for thought, people able to think about ways that they could broaden the avenues they have for getting food and nutrition for their family, for their friends, for their communities, without being beholden to and dependent on these large conglomerates and commercial narrow sources. And when people want to find out more about your work, Joel, where can they turn?
They can come to our website, Polyface Farms. That's Polyface, Polyface Farms, and we have a website there. It has lots of information on it. Let me tell you one piece of legislation for those who are savvy and want to. I mean, everybody's got different things that they love to do, and that's the Prime Act. It's sponsored by Congressman Thomas Massey out of Kentucky, and it is winding its way through Congress right now, trying to get sponsors and things like that. But it's called the Prime Act. You can Google it up and see it. And essentially, what it does is allow custom processed meat to be sold by the cut. So the beef, pork, lamb, goat, the meat. Poultry is not meat. So we're not talking about poultry. We're talking about meat. Goat, lamb, beef, pork, okay? And that has three levels of kind of whatever, slaughterhouses or processing in the U.S. One is federal inspected, one is state inspected, and one is called custom. And the federal, of course, is what you would think. It can be sold anywhere in the country, out of the country, anywhere in the world. State is it can be sold anywhere in the state, but not across the state lines. And custom is where I have a steer, say, and I take it to a butcher and say, I want you to kill it and process it. I'll come up and pick up the packages. And so he does that. I go and pick up the packages. Well, for years and years, people have sold what's called freezer beef or freezer pork by the half and quarter, by Dunnigan, you want a quarter of one of my beefs, so I take it down to the locker. When I take it to the butcher, I say, okay, the front left corner is owned by Dunnigan, the rear left quarter is owned by Mary Jo, and I put the names on that animal before slaughter, and then you get these quarters, okay? Now, if you come to me and say, well, I can't take a whole quarter, I just want 3 T-bone steaks off of that. Same animal, same butcher, same farmer, same freezer, same everything, same packages. I can't legally sell that to you because it didn't have your name on it before it was killed. So what the Prime Act does, what Congressman Thomas Massey's Prime Act does, is that it says, look, we've got the same animal, the same farmer, the same butcher, the same everything. Why should we discriminate against somebody who doesn't want to buy a whole quarter, only wants to buy 2 pounds of ground beef, for example, and discriminate against that person's ability to get smaller quantities than a quarter or a half or a whole? It's all from the same farmer, the same butcher, the same animal, same everything. We're going to let people do that. And so it's a wonderful attempt to start breaking some of this onerous stranglehold in the industry to, as I say, emancipate the food system from this stranglehold of things that have nothing to do with food safety. They're all about market accessibility and carefully controlling who has access to those market dollars.
Right, just anti-competitive barriers to entry by small producers.
Exactly, anti-competitive. Well said. Yes, yes.
Well, Joel, you always give us a lot to think about, and just so grateful for the time you spend here with us on Reluctant Preppers. We'd like to call you our activist farmer going forward, if that's all right with you.
That's just fine with me, and thank you for having me on. It's been a privilege and an honor.
Well, we'll look to have you again soon. You've got a lot of topics that you're able to speak on, and you speak from great, deep experience and a huge generosity of heart with all the families that you educate, the interns that you educate, and now you're educating us and our listeners as well, and we just thank you very much, Joel.
Great. Okay. Thank you.